Well, the latest on these missile attacks is that dozens of US and allied troops were apparently transported to Kuwait aboard Canadian aircraft ahead of the missile strikes that targeted military bases in Iraq. The relocation effort began Monday. It continued Tuesday, with the military personnel leaving Iraq for safety reasons. Now, senior military sources in Canada say civilians and unarmed personnel were being prioritised. And as we now know, they all escaped before Iran launched those 15 ballistic missiles into Iraq, targeting US and coalition forces. So is President Trump's tweet that all is well an accurate summation of the failure of the strikes? And either way, how will the United States respond from here? Malcolm Davis is from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. He joins us now from Canberra. Thank you very much for your time, Malcolm.
My pleasure.
We knew that they'd punch back. How expected was this kind of punch within military circles?
Look, I think it was a fairly limited strike, a limited number of ballistic missiles on two targets. They were clearly precision weapons because they were deliberately targeted away from likely areas where US forces would be. And so it was a demonstrative strike, basically a message to President Trump saying, we're prepared to stop here if you are. And so it really does depend on now on where President Trump decides to take this. Will he retaliate against that strike or will he back down?
So you're fairly confident that what occurred in Iraq was an attempt to miss the main targets, these bases that were housing both coalition and US forces, that was deliberately a miss?
Yeah, it was a form of communication. If the Iranians had wanted to hit those bases in the critical areas where there were likely to be US forces, they could have done so. They have the precision strike capabilities with their ballistic missiles. But instead, they didn't. They targeted other areas of those bases. So I see this very much as a means of communication, an initial, basically, message to President Trump.
Do the Americans, though, have that anti-missile technology which could thwart ballistic missile strike that was on target?
Not in the region. They do have anti-missile capabilities, systems like THAAD and so forth, but clearly they didn't use it this time because they felt that their forces were not under threat. They can deploy anti-missile capabilities into the region on naval vessels, but in this particular instance they didn't use that capability.
The latest is that troops have been flown out for about 2 days prior to the attack. Is that your information? And that wouldn't surprise you, would it?
Look, it wouldn't surprise me in terms of the US taking reasonable force protection measures. It doesn't necessarily imply a US withdrawal from Iraq. What it does mean is that the US isn't taking any chances just in case the Iranians did try to inflict casualties. Now, as I said, the key issue is what does President Trump do next? Does he retaliate? In which case, I would expect US forces to be redeployed into theatre to be able to counter any Iranian move, going forward.
Americans have never really retaliated equivalently. They've usually done something that's about tenfold what has occurred against their territory or their people. What are you expecting from Donald Trump then?
If he does retaliate, then I think that he'll be wanting to avoid a rapid escalation that's unnecessary and out of proportion. So he will be sitting down with his military advisors and working out a strike package comprising cruise missiles, air-launched ballistic missiles and precision air attacks from things like the stealth capabilities to be able to hit with precision against Iranian military forces in a manner that limits their ability to continue to strike US forces in the region. So it's called damage limitation strikes.
Or is there a possibility here that this is the end of major hostilities, that Trump won't fight back, that he doesn't want an endless war, as he said on previous occasions many, many times?
I mean, that's a distinct possibility, and I think that's the possibility that everyone is hoping for, because if the US does retaliate against these initial strikes, then the Iranians are more likely to respond and retaliate again. And then you have the real dangerous potential for an action-reaction response versus counter-response cycle that is escalatory, and we end up sliding into a major war that no one wants. So I think it's quite possible that Trump may take the diplomatic off-ramp, paint it as his victory because no Americans died, and satisfy his base and move on from there. But the Americans would certainly be ready for any Iranian response that were to come down the pike.
So where does Russia and China sit here? They obviously will be watching closely.
For Russia, I think that Moscow would be hoping for an extended and enhanced military conflict that would drive up the price of oil. That would benefit their economy, and it would also open up the Iranians to Russian military assistance in the form of weapons supply and intelligence support. I don't see the Russians as necessarily intervening directly because that would be too escalatory and too risky. For the Chinese, their main concern is maintaining their access to oil. They don't want to see the oil cut off because that would harm their economy. So I think the Chinese will be placing strong pressure on the Iranians not to block the supply of oil. But certainly, I think for the Chinese, what they want to see is the US stuck in a briar patch in the Middle East that is basically sucked into another endless war, so that the Chinese have a greater hand and a greater freedom to do what they want to do in the Indo-Pacific region.
Yeah, absolutely. What about Iran's reach in United States territory? What about this escalates and Trump tries to fire missiles at certain medium targets, but then all of a sudden Iran decides, right, we're now going to hit back on United States territory. What kind of reach and what kind of accessibility do they have, though?
Well, they might have terrorist cells operating in the US, but they'd be under observation by US domestic intelligence, FBI, and so forth.
But they've already said we have property belonging to Trump that we have our eye on.
Well, they would say that, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's true. But yes, I wouldn't dismiss the notion that they might have terrorist cells ready to go in the US. But what I'm more worried about would be cyber attacks that the Iranians could carry out against critical infrastructure, and also the potential for counter-space attacks. The Iranians have the ability to be able to jam satellite communications and potentially spoof GPS, and that could create havoc in the US as well. So it's the cyber and the space side of things, maybe combined with these sort of small numbers of cells that could cause havoc and create casualties in the US.
Malcolm Davis, thank you very much for your time.